Einen wunderschönen guten Morgen aus dem sonnig heißen São Paulo. Ich begrüße Sie sehr herzlich zur ersten Ausgabe unserer Webinarreihe EXPERT FORUM Brazil. Wir haben es wirklich sehr heiß, heute 32 Grad bereits um 10 Uhr morgens. Und es freut mich sehr, dass Sie sich heute die Zeit nehmen, mehr über die Perspektiven der brasilianischen Wirtschaft zu erfahren. Bevor wir uns in den Inhalt stürzen, ein paar technische Informationen. Sollten Sie irgendein Problem haben, mit Hören oder andere technische Probleme, wenden Sie sich bitte an meine Kollegen Jakob Lazar und Raphael Borian. Sie finden Ihre Kontakte im Chatfenster. Sie können bereits während der Vorträge Ihre Fragen und Fragenfenster posten. Ich werde diese dann im Anschluss der Vorträge versuchen zu beantworten, gemeinsam mit unserer Ökonomin Alessandra Ribeiro. Das Webinar wird aufgezeichnet und die Aufzeichnung des Webinars finden Sie dann in Kürze auf dem YouTube-Channel der Außenwirtschaft Austria. Außerdem erhalten Sie morgen ein E-Mail mit der Bitte um Ihr Feedback. In diesem Mail finden Sie auch die Präsentationsslides zum Download. So, dann gehen wir nun zum inhaltlichen Ablauf. Sie sehen hier, was wir uns für heute vorgenommen haben. Es ist zuerst, möchte ich Ihnen kurz noch ein bisschen mehr zu unserer Webinar erzählen. Dann werden wir kurz auf die Situation der österreichischen Exporteure und Investoren in Brasilien eingehen. Und danach folgt der Kernpunkt des heutigen Webinars, die Keynote von Alessandra Ribeiro, the Brazilian Economy and its main sectors. Alessandra wird ihre Präsentation auf Englisch halten. Im Anschluss haben wir die Möglichkeit zur Q&A-Session. Ich hoffe, Sie haben einige Fragen, die Sie uns stellen werden und die wir dann im Rahmen dieser Q&A-Session beantworten werden. Unser Webinar wird spätestens um 11 Uhr zu Ende gehen. Dann stürzen wir uns gleich hinein. Was haben wir uns vorgenommen mit der Webinar EXPERT FORUM Brazil? Wir haben uns gedacht, es ist aufgrund der Covid-Krise, der Reisebeschränkungen wahnsinnig schwierig, Präsenzveranstaltungen zu halten. Wie man hierher reisen, ist auch für uns schwierig, nach Österreich zu kommen derzeit. Daher haben wir uns vorgenommen, mit einem 18-teiligen Webinar-Programm Ihnen die wichtigsten Sektoren näher zu bringen, die kürzlichen Entwicklungen, Chancen in diesen Sektoren und auch wichtige Themen wie Firmengründung, Niederlassungsmanagement, Exportfragen, Rechtsfragen, wie mit Dienstleistungen, richtig Exporten, Warenexportfragen etc. Ein kurzer Überblick hier. Was haben wir im Oktober noch für Sie geplant? Es beginnt am 14.10. mit dem Sektorfokus. Wir werden uns den Bereich Sicherheit und Verteidigung genauer ansehen. Dazu haben wir eingeladen Manfred Hauser, den Geschäftsführer von Brasilien. Eine Woche danach geht es um das wichtige Thema Gesundheit und Life Sciences. Hier wird uns Roberto Martini, der CEO der Latini Group, als Sprecher zur Verfügung stehen. Er ist ein sehr renommierter Begleiter von ausländischen Unternehmen, die am brasilianischen Gesundheitsmarkt Fuß fassen wollen. Das letzte Webinar im Oktober betrifft den wichtigen Öl- und Gassektor. Sie wissen, das ist einer der wichtigsten Ölproduzenten der Welt. Wir haben für Ronaldo Martins gewinnen können. Er war langjährig Einkaufsmanager bei Petrobras in Brasilien und ist heute der Geschäftsführer der Firma Unsere Spezialistinnen. Im November und Dezember haben wir weitere spannende Webinare für Sie. Zuerst, wie bereits angesprochen, das Gründung bzw. das Krisenmanagement von Niederlassungen in Brasilien. Es geht um den Eisenbahnsektor, ein wichtiges Thema Abfallwirtschaft, Wasserversorgung, Abwasser. Hier gab es wichtige regulatorische Änderungen in Brasilien, die jetzt Investitionen des Privatsektors zulassen. In der Folge diskutieren wir Fragen des Dienstleistungsexports nach Brasilien. Im Dezember dann schon widmen wir uns auf den wichtigen Bergbausektor. Sie wissen, das ist ein ganz wichtiger Themenbereich des Eisenerzabbaus, aber auch bei vielen anderen Mineralien, Nickel zum Beispiel, oder auch Gold. als letztes Webinar in diesem Jahr fokussieren wir uns auf den Warenexport und die relevanten Fragen dazu. Einerseits, welche Finanzierungsangebote kann man machen und welche Steuerfragen muss man bedenken. Und im nächsten Jahr geht es noch sehr intensiv weiter. Ich werde jetzt nicht auf jedes Thema eingehen, aber Sie sehen eine wirklich breite Möglichkeit, sich über Brasilien zu informieren. Sie erhalten ja im Anschluss morgen diese Slides. Wir haben jede Veranstaltung verlinkt, sodass Sie sich auch direkt anmelden können. Gehen wir zum nächsten Kapitel zur Situation österreichischer Exporteure und Investoren in Brasilien. Man kann schwer berichten, ohne kurz auf den auf die Covid-Situation im Land einzugehen. Sie sehen hier, Brasilien ist das Land, das am zweitstärksten von Covid in Mitleidenschaft gezogen wurde, was die Zahl der Todesopfer betrifft. Am Sonntagabend standen wir offiziell bei 146.352 Todesopfern. Tendenz nach wie vor steigend, die Kurve hat sich leicht abgeflacht, ist aber nach wie vor sorgenserregend. Das heißt, dass zahlreiche Büros oder der Großteil der Büros, wo es möglich ist, haben einen Großteil der Mitarbeiter nach wie vor im Homeoffice. Gleichzeitig gibt es aber so eine etwas eigenartige, aber doch neue Normalität im Einzelhandel, in der Gastronomie. Es ist eigentlich wieder so gut wie alles geöffnet. Es ist wieder ganz normale Bewegung auf den Straßen, die Leute verwenden allerdings Masken. Dazu kommen noch Reisebeschränkungen, also Tourismus für Brasilianer nach Europa ist nach wie vor nicht möglich. Für Österreich gibt es mittlerweile die Möglichkeit, im Rahmen von gewerblicher Tätigkeit für Ausnahmen zu erlangen, dass brasilianische Geschäftspartner nach Österreich kommen können. Falls Sie hier Fragen haben, melden Sie sich bei uns. Wir können Ihnen da mehr Informationen geben. Die Reisen für österreichische Geschäftspartner nach Brasilien sind wieder ganz problemlos möglich. Sie müssen nur eine Krankenversicherung vorlegen können, die über die Zeitraum der Reise gültig ist und die auch Behandlung für Covid-Fälle beinhaltet. Hier sehen Sie die österreichischen Exporte, die haben sich entwickelt in den letzten Jahren. Ich habe sozusagen zur Illustration Covers des Wirtschaftsmagazins Economin darunter gelegt. Sie sehen hier 2009 begann das brasilianische Wirtschaftswunder dieses Jahrtausends. Brasil takes off. Trotz damaliger Finanzkrise ist Brasilien ganz stark gewachsen und gleichzeitig auch unsere Exporte nach Brasilien. Sie sehen, 2012 haben wir den bisherigen Rekord mit über 1 Milliarde Euro Export nach Brasilien geschafft. Danach, wie Sie hier sehen, has Brazil blown it, sagt der Economist ab 2013, sind auch unsere Exporte wieder massiv zurückgegangen. Das hat sich dann noch verschlimmert durch die massive Rezession in Brasilien, die Ende 2014 begonnen hat und 2015 und 2016 jeweils mehr als minus 3% Schrumpfung verursacht hat. Danach ging es wieder bergauf mit unseren Exporten. Wie Sie sehen, 2017 wieder ein sehr starkes Wachstum und auch 2018, wo wir wieder 833 Millionen Euro exportiert haben. Das letzte Jahr, das laufen wir mit etwas Detailblick ansehen. Sie sehen hier mit Quartalen, dass es sich eigentlich bis zum ersten Quartal 2020 unsere Exporte sehr positiv entwickelt hätten, wäre nicht der Coronavirus gekommen. Sie sehen hier am 25. Februar in der Wechselkursgrafik darunter eingezeichnet, war der erste bestätigte Covid-19-Fall in Brasilien und danach ging es mit dem Wechselkurs bergab sozusagen aus Exporteurssicht. Der Euro hat sich aus brasilianischer Sicht wahnsinnig verteuert, während er bei 4,5 Real pro Euro vor Covid liegt er heute bei über 6. Das heißt, die Währung hat sich um 50% abgewertet. Das macht das Exportieren schwieriger, wie sich auch in den Exportzahlen niederschlägt. Gleichzeitig hat natürlich den größten Impact die veränderte Wirtschaftsleistung sowohl in Brasilien als auch in der ganzen Welt. Hier ganz klar starke Auswirkungen. Wenn wir uns hier ansehen, was exportiert Österreich eigentlich, sehen Sie, es ist wahnsinnig breit aufgestellt, unser Exportportfolio. Die wichtigsten Positionen sind Pharmaprodukte, Antitherapie-Fraktionen. Ein anderer sehr wichtiger Einzelpunkt, das sind Getränke. Das ist diese 34 Millionen, diese sind eigentlich zu 99% auf einen Energy Drink zurückzuführen. Wichtige Gesamtposition, wo natürlich mehrere Unternehmen dann drinnen sind Maschinen und Anlagen. Und ganz wichtig, elektrische Maschinen. Und das waren 42 Millionen, hier geht es vor allem um Wechselrichter. Also da sehen Sie, der starke Zuwachs in der Solarindustrie hat hier ganz klar diese Exportposition verbessert. Aber Sie sehen generell, es gibt Luftfahrtzulieferungen, Fahrzeuge, Motoren, chemische Erzeugnisse, Messgeräte, Eisen und Stahl. Das ist wirklich sehr, sehr breit gefächert. Weniger breit gefächert das sind die Exporte Brasiliens nach Österreich. Sie sind hier die wichtigste Position sind Nahrungsmittel, wir haben Früchte, Fruchtsäfte, Fleisch, Kaffee etc. Rohstoffe sehr wichtig, etwa Eisenerz, Schwefelsstoffe, Zellstoff, chemische Erzeugnisse, bearbeitete Waren und Maschinenbauzeugnisse. Wie sieht es für die österreichischen Investitionen in Brasilien beziehungsweise auch in andere die brasilianischen Investitionen in Österreich aus? Wir haben heute etwa 200 österreichische Niederlassungen in Brasilien. Das ist eine gute Zahl. Man muss auch betonen, dass es 2016 noch 250 Niederlassungen waren. Das heißt, über diese Jahre der Krise haben gerade kleinere Niederlassungen zugesperrt, weil es einfach ökonomisch nicht Sinn macht, die aufrechtzuerhalten. Gleichzeitig haben aber die bedeutenderen Investitionen, die bedeutenden Niederlassungen in die Vergrößerung investiert. Brasilien ist aufgrund des Wechselkurses wieder deutlich günstiger geworden. Das heißt, es gibt die Möglichkeit, sowohl der Übernahmen von Unternehmen als auch durchaus spannende Segmente zu investieren. Der Großteil der Niederlassungen sind Vertriebsniederlassungen, wir haben doch etwa 60 produzierende Niederlassungen in Brasilien. Der österreichische FDI-Bestand ist stabil, wie Sie sehen, schwankt um 1 Milliarde Euro. Wir sind gleichzeitig ein wichtiger Arbeitgeber, die österreichische Industrie, hier mit etwa 10.000 Mitarbeitern in Brasilien. In die andere Richtung ist die Logik der Investition eine ganz andere. Hier gibt es eine Holdinggesellschaften, brasilianische Multis, sind etwa 20, die in Österreich investieren, nutzen das doppelte Steuersabkommen zur Steueroptimierung. Und Sie sehen ja auch, dass der Wert und dann Portfolio der direkten Investition deutlich höher ist, mit irgendwo bei derzeit etwa 3 Milliarden Euro. Damit habe ich Ihnen einen Überblick geben können über die Wirtschaftslage aus Sicht der österreichischen Volksakteure und Investoren. I would now like to invite Alessandra to turn on her microphone. Alessandra, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us, the Austrian business community in Austria. Once again, I like to refer to Alessandra as the chief economist of the Austrian business community. So Alessandra, the floor is yours.
Hi to everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of this event. I'd like to thank Klaus once again for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be with you to talk about the Brazilian economy. So I will start with a picture of the Brazilian economy, talking about main topics, what's going on in the Brazilian economy. And then I will focus on the main points and main projections. When we talk about the main points, so what's going on in the Brazilian economy? Well, I have seen the worst moment of the pandemic for the Brazilian economy in the second quarter. Contraction in the Brazilian GDP was much in line with the contraction seen in the developed economies and also in emerging economies. And what's behind, in our view, is the monetary and fiscal strong stimuli by the Brazilian government and also by the Brazilian central bank. This strong stimuli was important in our view to limit effects of the pandemic for the Brazilian economy in the second quarter. So in the second quarter, in our view, was the worst moment for Brazil. Of course, on the other side, we have challenges, especially related to the end of this emergency programs. So we are really cautious about the economic consequences of the end of these programs. And also, we are discussing in Brazil more permanent social programs, giving the negative effects of the pandemic, especially for the poor people. But the problem is our fiscal situation is really complex. I will show some numbers. Effects of the pandemic for the Brazilian fiscal accounts are really important. So we have to deal with the fiscal responsibility on one side. On the other side, we are discussing permanent transfers for especially poor people. So it's really challenging, this equation. So there are really high uncertainties related to this fiscal and political issue. But despite all the negative effects of the pandemic for the economy and also the uncertainties related to challenges that we have, especially from 2021 on, are positive things going on in Brazil. And I would like to highlight some changes in regulation approved by the Congress, Brazilian Congress, related to sanitation, also related to gas. And we are seeing by the Brazilian Central Bank an important agenda related to the banking system in order to increase competition, to lower credit costs, what is really important to increase this credit panel to spur GDP growth. So despite all this challenging moment in Brazil, we are seeing the agenda going on, especially on this microeconomic agenda. So this is the big picture. Now I will show you some numbers. When I said that the contraction in Brazil was in line with the average seen in other countries, developed and emerging economies, here I brought a sample with the GDP contraction in the second quarter, and the average was 12.5%. And in Brazil, as you can see by the chart, the Brazilian economy contracted 11.4% in the second quarter. So given the challenged pandemic situation in Brazil, when we look at the economic effects, they were much in line with the rest of the world. And in our view, this is highly related to stimuli, monetary and fiscal, especially fiscal stimuli. And this is why it's so challenging from 2021 on when we reduce and we end some important part of this stimuli. I also brought here a chart to show you how we are seeing the recovery format in Brazil. I think it's clear to see a picture for the numbers. I think that's easier to understand the projections. Here in this chart, you can see 3 points, A, B, and C, and what they mean. Point A, the first moment of the pandemic, when the isolation measures were necessary, and also the shutdown of some activities. And we have a strong contraction of the Brazilian economic activity. So this is this first movement to A point. once you flexibilize the isolation measures and start to opening some activities, you have the other moment going to be point that is a quite fast recovery, because you post everything. Once you open some part of these activities, we have quite a fast recovery. We can see in this first moment a V format. But we also expect a second moment of this recovery trend from B to C. And this, as you can see, is a much more gradual recovery, because in our view, it's related to permanent effects of the pandemic, especially to small companies, small and medium companies, and the effects for the labor market, and also the uncertainties related to our fiscal situation. So the second part of the recovery trend, as you can see, is a much flatter curve, so much more gradual. We do not expect a V format for the whole recovery process in Brazil as the pandemic period. So we are really cautious about this second moment, and this is going to be clear in the projections that I will present to you. So in the next slide, I also brought a comparison of sectors for you to see that recovery is really heterogeneous. As you can see by the chart, we see a very strong resume pace in retail sales. In fact, retail sales, when we look at the level, it's above the pre-pandemic level. So it's really strong. In fact, it's nothing new. When we look at the US and even also in Europe, it's the same trend. When we look at retail sales recover faster than the other sectors. So it's the same thing in Brazil. When we look at the industrial production, this is this gray line. Recovery is much more gradual. It's possible to see this V format, this first moment, V format, but it's well below its pre-pandemic level. And services is suffering much more. It's possible to see a slight recovery right now, but its level is well far away from the pre-pandemic level. So services segment is suffering, is still suffering quite a lot. And of course, it's also heterogeneous when we look among sectors inside services. For example, services to families are suffering much more. And when we talk about services to families, we're talking about restaurants, tourism, these kind of things. So this segment in services is, for example, just to give you a number, 50% below its pre-pandemic level. So it's really heterogeneous among sectors. So it's what we are seeing right now in the Brazilian economy. Well, now I would like to present our main projections for the Brazilian economy. I brought here the GDP projections for Brazil. So in our baseline scenario, we are projecting minus 5.6% for GDP this year. And an important point, we have upward revised this number. Our former number was around 7% of GDP fall. So we were stronger surprised by the stimuli, as I said. So the effects of the stimuli were stronger than expected. So that's why we have upward revised number for this year. So is GDP falling around 5.6%, and next year, and we are projecting the Brazilian economy growing 2.9%. It's also important to say that the Brazilian economy, when we look at the GDP we recover our pre-pandemic GDP level with this variation just in 2022, when the economy grows around 2%. So just in 2022, we recover pre-pandemic GDP level, right? Because we are seeing variation. So this is the trend. It's also, I would like to highlight that this is our baseline scenario with the higher probability of occurrence. And one important hypothesis behind that is that Brazil sustain its fiscal responsibility, its main rules, especially the rules related to expenditure control. So this is the main hypothesis behind this number. We have alternative scenarios, for example, a pessimistic scenario which considers flexibilization of these rules and a much more adverse fiscal trend for Brazil and also for economy and so on. Well, in the next slide, I brought here the GDP breakdown. When we look at GDP, we look from the demand side and also from the supply side. When we look from the demand side, the lower part of the table, it's possible to see that the lines that suffer the most this year are household consumption, falling around 6.5%, and investments falling around 7%. So these lines are the ones, even with the whole stimuli, suffering much more. And of course, when we look on the supply side, this is mainly related to industry and especially services. Exception here, the agribusiness sector. As you can see, we are projecting the agribusiness sector growing around 1.2%, and this is linked to especially to soybean production, meat production, and so we are having a strong performance in these items. And also, it's also important to say our base of comparison basis here is very high because the agribusiness sector has been growing quite a lot in the former years. So growing 1.2% this year, considering this high comparison basis, shows the strong performance of the sector. And for 2021, we are considering lines that suffered most this year recovering. It's a partial recovery for 2021 when we talk about household consumption and investments, and also from the supply side, talking about industry and services. As you can see by my table, industry has a faster recovery than services because we are seeing much more permanent effects of the pandemic for services segment. So that's why the pace, recovery trend, recovery pace is lower in the services segment. Well, now I will show you some fundamentals behind this projection. And the first one is related to labor market. So just to give you an idea, from March until July, the Brazilian economy lost 11 million jobs. But the most important part of this loss was related to informal jobs. So we are seeing that the effects of the pandemic for the labor market are much more regressive. They affect much more the poor people with less qualified, of course, with lower salaries. So the main impacts are on the poor people in Brazil. And talk about numbers, I brought here in the table the unemployment rate. We are project the unemployment rate to reach almost 14% this year. Next year, in relation to last year was 11.9%. So we are talking about 2 percentage points of increase. But next year, as you can see here, we are projecting a higher unemployment rate, with unemployment rate reaching almost at 16%. And what is behind? This is a little bit tricky to understand, but what's behind? People that lost jobs also left the labor market this year. They're not looking for jobs because the economy is quite weak. Some segments are still closed. So, and then also there is the fear of the pandemic. So people are not looking for jobs, but we expect in a much more normal situation, these people going back to the labor market to look for jobs. And the Brazilian economy, in fact, in our view, is going to generate jobs next year. As you can see here by the table, occupation is falling around 7% this year, and we are projecting 5.5% next year. But it's not sufficient to absorb all these people. So that's why the unemployment rate still increases next year. And also, I'd like to highlight in this slide, the last line, the real wage mass. What is that? A composition of employment with real income, real salaries. And when we look at this measure, this real wage mass is falling around 2.6%. We expect a partial recovery next year with this measure growing around 1.5%. So when we look at the labor market with all this composition, income is falling. But when we consider all the social transfers, especially this emergency aid for poor people, not just for poor people, but people who have informal jobs, the situation is totally different. As you can see here by this chart, when we consider the total income, we put everything there, especially these government transfers. Total income increased this year 4.5%. 4.5%. But next year, with the reduction of these programs, we expect its total income to fall 4.2%. So this is the point of our caution when we talk about 2021. So that's why we are not so optimistic about 2021. There are some projections in the market saying that the Brazilian economy is going to grow a little bit more than 4%. So we're really cautious about this phasing out of the emergency programs. Well, and so looking at the other variable, inflation and interest rate, when we look at inflation, inflation is still well behaved in Brazil. I brought here the consumer inflation. And as you can see, we're projecting 1.9% this year and 3% next year. It's 2 years with inflation below the target. In fact, we are seeing some pressures in some items like food, for example, given the increase in commodity prices and also the strong depreciation of our currency. But the pressures are they are really specific. When we look at the whole basket, the consumer inflation as a whole is really well behaved. And in our view, despite the expectation of some increase in consumer inflation, it's really well below the target. So it gives us central bank space for a very, very stimulative monetary policy. So the Brazilian central bank has been reducing the interest rate. So our interest rate is nowadays at 2%, and in our view is going to remain at this level for quite a good time. We expect normalization, a very gradual normalization of the monetary policy beginning at the end of next year. So this is why you are seeing interest rate going to 3%, 5%, and 6%. So the interest rate go back to what we estimate as equilibrium interest rate in Brazil. But once again, this is our baseline scenario, and it has as an important hypothesis the fiscal responsibility. And in this sense, I'd like to show you our estimation for public debt in Brazil in the next years, considering maintenance of the fiscal rules, especially the ceiling rule. What's this rule? This ceiling rule does not allow public expenditure to grow in real terms in Brazil. It's a strong one. It's really a strong one. And we are facing really difficult times discussing how we increase social transfers in a permanent way with this rule. This rule is really necessary to control expenditure and consequently indebtedness. And here, just to give an idea, this is our trend for public debt considering this rule. So public debt increases to almost 97% this year, and we are projecting 100% in 2024. In fact, the peak is in 2025, with the public debt is likely above 100%. So that's why we cannot mess with the fiscal situation. And this is why this is a driver for our pessimistic scenario, which considers the flexibilization of the fiscal rules and a much stronger increase in expenditure and indebtedness. Well, and talking also about the exchange rate. Exchange rate in Brazil nowadays is operating at 5.60 reais per dollar. And our expectation in the baseline scenario is of some appreciation considering these next months. And once in the baseline scenario we consider a reduction in the fiscal uncertainty, there is a space for some appreciation. As you can see, it's not a strong appreciation. We are projecting 5.35 at the end of this year and 5.25 for the end of next year. So it's not a strong appreciation, given these local issues, factors that we are really cautious about the impact on economic activity from 2021 on. We expect some recovery, but it's a gradual one in our view. So it limits the space for a stronger appreciation in the Brazilian currency. We just project a more stronger appreciation from 2022 on, and this is mainly related to higher interest rates in Brazil once we normalize our monetary policy. And in my final part, I would like to talk about the main sectors, how we are seeing the performance of the main sectors in Brazil. So I brought here a timeline recovery, and what's the criteria behind to build this timeline recovery? What we considered projections for these sectors for 2021 and 22. So considering the level of production, here we are talking about production of these sectors at the end of 2022, and we compare this level with the average seen between 17 and 19. The idea here is to know when we recover past levels, especially the pre-pandemic levels. This is the criteria behind. So as you can see, as a very fast recovery trend, we expect for some primary sectors like petroleum and biofuels, mining, and paper and cellulose. And what is behind? We count on strong, very strong external demand, especially Asian demand. And also there were important investments in these sectors in the past. And these past investments have been translating in production increase. So this is what is behind this view about the very fast sectors talking about recovery. When we talk about fast, now we qualify as fast recovery trend, we are highlighting machinery and equipment, and also what we call no-metallic minerals. These no-metallic minerals are essentially related to construction. All the segments related to construction. So we are seeing the performance of these two sectors as fast. In the first case, machinery and equipment also counting on the effect of the stimulative monetary policy. We know that credit for this sector is very, very important, also for construction. So that's why we expect stronger performance. And also, we are counting on external demand because we also export some machineries and equipment. So we are also count on our scenario for the international economy and main partners. Now, and when we talk about slow and very slow, as you can see, when we talk about slow, we are highlighting here, for example, food, other chemicals. When we talk about other chemicals, for example, we are talking about fertilizers, I'm talking about caustic soda, resins, this kind of things. So especially other chemicals, in our view, we suffer with external competition. So it's really, really difficult for Brazil to compete. It's not difficult, but it's challenging for Brazil to compete with strong partners or in the international economy. So it's a limitation when we talk about other chemicals. And food, after a strong increase in production this year, we expect some accommodation in 21 and 22. When we talk about metallurgy, it's also highly related to automotive sector. As you can see, we qualify the automotive sector as very slow. And this is very slow has behind our trend expected for the domestic demand, giving the gradual recovery of the labor market, giving the financial situation of the families after the end or after the phasing out of the emergency programs. So we are cautious about the automotive demand from the domestic point of view. Of course, we also count on the international economy because we export also vehicles to other countries here in the region, and also we export to US. But when we look at our main partner here in the region, Argentina, the expectation for Argentina is not really well. In fact, we are expecting Argentina to show a very weak performance for quite a good time. So it limits also the export trend. But the main point here behind qualify automotive as a very slow sector is domestic demand. So metallurgy as a slow recovery trend is related also to automotive sector. So here a very fast overview about our sectors and recovery timeline for the sectors here as seen, considering our fundamentals. So just to conclude, as I said, we expect the Brazilian economy to resume its pre-pandemic level, GDP level in 2022. The main uncertainties are related to the political and fiscal issue. Looking at our baseline scenario, we see positive factors and also cautious factors. Positive factors: stimulative monetary policy, precautionary savings, which gives support to demand during the phasing out of the emergency programs, and also the advances in the macroeconomic agenda, as I said. And also, when we look at the caution factors, we highlight uncertainty related to the fiscal issue, and also the permanent effects of the pandemic for small companies, small and medium companies, and impacts in the labor market. So that's why we expect a gradual recovery of the labor market, limiting also the domestic demand. So I think this is a quick overview of the Brazilian economy and its main sectors. So now we can discuss a little bit more in the Q&A section. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Alessandra. That was very interesting, and to some extent, a bit of caution. There's a little bit of optimism there, we can see, depending on the sectors. And I would like to dig in right away into our Q&A session. I think a few questions are interesting for the both of us. We can both chip in with the answers. One, I'll leave up to you. There's the question, what is GFCF, the gross fixed capital formation? I know what it means, but maybe you can explain it a little better, what you mean by that.
Yeah, it's true. I forgot to explain, sorry. That's it, it's investments. And these investments have two main parts. Construction is considered in this line, and also consumption, capital goods consumption. It's also considered in this line. So this is what is behind investments in general.
Okay, thank you. There's one question that we might both try to answer. There's the question, I mean, it's a very Austrian question though. There's, I mentioned that in 2016 we had 250 subsidiaries, Austrian subsidiaries in Brazil. Now we have 200. There was a reduction because of the long years of economic crisis in Brazil, or stagnation. And the question was, so how many will survive post-COVID? And I mean, I would like to start saying that I think that most of them will survive. Why? Because this is not a Brazilian crisis. It's not so much related to Brazilian structural issues as was this 5-year stretch of recession and stagnation. Of course, Brazil will have to struggle to some extent, but the good thing about our companies, and this is what we hear from many business consultants, we've talked to this, that the Austrian subsidiaries here, they have reacted very well over the last 5 years. If the business wasn't really feasible in the long run, they closed it down, and all the others really set up very lean operations. So wherever possible, they outsourced parts of the companies. They really have very lean operations nowadays, most of them. And many of them are now actually producing in Brazil, are taking advantage of the low exchange rate, and are now, what I've just talked last week with a friend about who is the head of a local subsidiary. He said that they are now competitive with China in the production of the components they work with. So it's quite interesting to see there are different dynamics. So I don't see that COVID is going to destroy a lot of our subsidiaries here. It will be tough, of course, but it will really depend also on the recovery, how quick it is. But since you said, Alessandra, in 2022 we will be back to where we are right now, I think that gives us room for some cautious optimism that it's not going to be that bad. But I'll let you comment on this as well, Alessandra.
Now, I agree totally, Klaus. I agree, because if we maintain the main macroeconomic pillars, and what I'm trying to say is, if we deal well with our fiscal issue, and considering all the agenda that's going on, especially in the microeconomic area, we see space for a gradual recovery in our baseline scenario. So we go back to 2022 level. And if we go, it's our optimistic scenario. It has a lower probability, but we have an optimistic scenario. For example, if we approve a tax reform in Brazil, a real tax reform in Brazil, implementing a VAT considering the 3 levels of the government, we go to another reality in terms of potential GDP growth. And we are talking about the Brazilian economy growing around 3.54%. So here we has been cautious, but if things go better, especially to structural reforms, we have space to a stronger performance of the Brazilian economy. So I totally agree.
Thank you. What do you think is the situation and the perspective of the construction sector?
Well, construction sector has been surprising us, in fact. And one part of the surprise, in our view, is related to the emergency aid program. As I said, the total income this year is increasing around 4.5%. And we are seeing that some part of these people is using this money, these transfers, to invest in, in their homes, to improve, to invest in construction, small reforms at home, this kind of thing. So construction in general has been having a really good performance. We expect some accommodation once the emergency programs are reduced, but on the other side, we have a very, very monetary stimulative policy, and this is very important for the construction sector. By our models, construction sector responds very well to lower interest rates. So that's why our view would also consider investments in general is positive for construction sector. And I'm talking about real estate, but when we talk about infrastructure, do not expect strong advances in 2021. We expect the initial effect of the infrastructure program, considering sanitation, new gas law, at the final part of 2022. This is also in our scenario, in our baseline scenario.
Thank you. We have time for one last question, which is actually it's 2 questions. One is targeting the automotive sector. You were mentioning the slow recovery that you're expecting. We have a specific question on the bus industry. Public transport might be slightly different. We would like to know that how are companies like Marco Polo performing in recovering? What do you think?
Sorry, Klaus, about the automotive industry, but I didn't understand.
The production of buses, passenger buses. You have companies like Marco Polo. How are these performing? Do you think they're just in the same bad state as the automotive industry as a whole, or do they have better opportunities because they also depend on public spending, etc.?
Mm-hmm. Well, what we are seeing when we look at this passenger vehicles, in fact, we are seeing quite a good recovery in terms of sales, and what is also linked to credit with lower interest rates. So we are seeing credit also making huge effect for vehicles, passenger vehicle sales. But in terms of production, we are seeing this recovery trend, but it is slow because we had a huge stock once the pandemic appeared. So we are digesting all these stocks to support the sales. But when we look at 2021, we're also cautious about the strength sales, passenger vehicle sales in 2021, because we have this phasing out of the programs, emergency programs, When we look at the labor market, at the financial situation of the families, it's still very delicate to support or to be very optimistic about vehicle sales. So that's why it's a positive number. It's growing next year, but not as fast as we have been seeing the last months. We do not expect this sales to be this pace to be sustained in 2021.
Perfect. So I thank you all for your questions. We won't have time to answer all of them today. What we will do, our office will get back to you on your specific questions that we could not answer today during this webinar. I would like to once again thank you very much, Alessandra, for your time and an excellent presentation. It's really adding a lot of value and really helping us in thinking of the future of the Brazilian economy. Thank you so much for that. I would like to invite all the Austrian companies who have watched us today. If you have any questions on the Brazilian market, please get in touch with us, write us saopaulo@wko.at, unsere E-Mail-Adresse. We would be happy to assist you in the Brazilian market. And we look forward to welcoming you during our next webinars. As you know, the next one is already next week on defense and security. And we have many others. Please check out this webinar series. Today was more of a broad overview of different sectors, but the next webinars will really go in depth in the specific sectors, and I'm sure we can add a lot of value to you and your companies. With that, in German bedanke ich mich nochmal ganz herzlich bei Alessandra Ribeiro. Bedanke mich ganz herzlich für Ihre Teilnahme, liebe Zuhörerinnen und Zuhörer, und wünsche einen sehr schönen Abend nach Österreich. Alles Gute und bis zum nächsten Mal.